Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our study group going through the history of philosophy without any gaps podcast by Peter Adamson. I'm Nerdalliun Plebz, and today with me, Rogério Marques and Gram Pong. Welcome back, guys.
Nice to be back.
Great to have another go with the man without any gaps, Aristotle.
The man without any gaps. So today we'll be discussing episodes 46, 47, 48 of the podcast. And we'll be covering some of Aristotle's views about the relation between his Nicomachean ethics and his politics. We'll be talking about his work on the politics and also his views on mind and God. So, we'll have kind of a fun one today.
Yeah, so we will wrap up his ethics that we started the previous session. And we will shed a bit of light and emphasize its orientation towards politics. So here we have Aristotle on the mental and political animal, guess who? There's a quote here that I excerpted from the copy I have of the Nicomachean Ethics. He, right at the very beginning, starts by saying, "If then there is some end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, clearly this must be the good and the chief good, and of which of the sciences or capacities it is the object. Politics appears to be of this nature. It legislates as to what we are to do and what we are to abstain from. The end of this science, or techne, must include those of the others, so that this end must be the good for men. Although it is worthwhile to attain the end merely for one man, it is finer and more godlike to attain it for a nation or for city-states." This goes pretty much in line with how Peter Adamson and his companion in the discussion, Dominic Scott, framed Nicomachean ethics in terms of its intended target audience.
Yeah, so they explain that it's intended for people who are already convinced that one should try to live a moral, ethical life, and for experienced people, so not for children, and typically for people who have ambitions or plans to participate in politics, so city politics, to try to give them practical advice. And Dominic Scott makes the argument that he doesn't think the Nicomachean Ethics should be read as like volume 6 of Aristotle's corpus, but rather volume 1 of 2 of Aristotle's teaching on politics, with the work on politics being volume 2 and the Nicomachean Ethics being volume 1.
The Peter Adamson and Dominic Scott also highlighted the contrast that there is between teaching Aristotle's ethics nowadays and in the heyday of Aristotle. So nowadays they teach Nicomachean ethics to 20 or 21-year-olds that might only be superficially interested in ethics, and most of them probably have no aspirations to get into politics. And so they drew a stark contrast between what was probably intended as a practical course for people that wanted to employ its lessons directly in life. They already had a practical aim for these lessons. And the Nicomachean Ethics is, as books on ethics go, it is more on the practical side, more on the advice side, less on the having fine detail and precision in describing human psychology. And so it makes sense that they would say this. Taking out.
Yeah, no, I was going to say it's really interesting that because the politics and all, Aristotle wrote that during Alexander's reign, and while he was doing conquest. So you have to wonder how much of that was informed from his time in the court of Philip and teaching Alexander, and how much of it was sort of like his version of Machiavelli's Prince, from the Renaissance era, sort of a treatise to the those in power at the time, how they should act. Tagging on that.
I think we'll probably get to that when we talk about specifically the work on politics, and I don't know how you guys feel. Maybe we could do them in a slightly different order than Peter Addison did. Maybe finish the Nicomachean Ethics, then do politics, then talk about mind and God.
Nothing against that.
Yeah, but just on that specifically, I think the comment that Peter Addison makes is that a lot of people kind of have this as a historical background in mind, and they expect to read a bunch about what they imagine Aristotle might have taught Alexander that made him such a great ruler. And he kind of says, well, people who expect that from Aristotle will walk away disappointed. So there's almost none of that in Aristotle, except for like a brief aside when he talks about different kinds of political organizations or constitutions. He briefly discusses the possibility that if in a city one person or a small group of people outstrip in greatness all of the rest of the city combined, then it may be rational for the city to just go ahead and submit to their authority, and like resisting their authority, and their will would in that case be similar to humans sort of resisting the authority and will of Zeus, who wouldn't make any sense. So it's like the closest he might come. I think Alexander very much fashioned him that kind of leader, so just so much superior to the others that his leadership is just completely natural and people should submit absolutely. But most of the politics considers very different situations from that. I guess the kingships in some sense are quite close to that. But to come back to the relation between the ethics and the politics, I think what Dominic Scott and Peterson kind of make clear is that in Aristotle's view, sort of the goal of doing politics right is to set the city up in such a way that it's conducive to the flourishing of the citizens and to their well-being. And so in order to create an organization that's conducive to the well-being of its citizens, you have to kind of understand the well-being of its citizens, like what the well-being is. So the Nicomachean Ethics is more or less a treatise on what it means for human beings to be well. So what is the well-being of human beings? And yeah, he sets that out in such a way that it ties in quite closely with a political life in any case. So yeah, closely related.
Yeah, Dominic Scott's quote: "The politician needs to have an outline of human happiness." Notice that he said outline, not a precise and very detailed picture, a technical picture. Human happiness involves activity in accordance with virtue. Of course, when we're talking about what happens in cities, it's very difficult to give a one-size-fits-all answer, because there are people from many different kinds of classifications. Poorer people, richer people, people with a more libertarian or more conservative view of how things should be run, people that like giraffes, people that don't like giraffes, etc. Here in Portugal, we even have the expression pleasing Greeks and Trojans. We use it when we are in situations in which it's impossible to please everyone perfectly. And Aristotle often characteristically would see the extremes and would try to choose something in the middle. There's also a comparison between the Eudemian ethics and the Nicomachean ethics that was brought up by in the conversation that sheds light into how maybe the Eudemian ethics might have been an earlier work that was more devoid of politics, according to them. I have not read it, so I cannot be so sure. And I also don't know if it's smaller than the Nicomachean ethics, but I'm kind of assuming it might be, and possibly more research oriented, more theoretical. While the Nicomachean ethics, it immediately starts by mentioning the importance of the techne of the political science, and it mentions many considerations from ethics in a broader sense, but always returning to the aim at achieving the good of a polis, of a city, in the ancient Greek sense.
Yeah, no, that's one of the things that jumps out. Is it's sort of like, for Aristotle, the ethics are a subset of the politics, where the ethics are talking about how the individual needs to behave, and it's once you combine it in the politics, again, going to the basic Greek roots, it's how the city should behave, how you set up the city for the individuals to act within. And that's the idea. If you don't understand how individuals are going to want to act, you're not going to be doing a very good job setting up a polis, a political organization for them. And I definitely can see the Eudemian ethics here being a predecessor, in the sense of he's doing it without reference to the political entity. And then the Nicodemean ethics was when he ties them all together into one system. Going to tag and let you guys run from there.
So the Nicodemean ethics, is it a third work, or were you mentioning the Nicomachean ethics? Just to be sure.
No. You caught me on my pronunciation.
Okay.
Disaster. Yep.
Fair enough. I was kind of wondering if there was another work to study. So yeah.
No. I was briefly conflating that with like the
Yeah.
Gospel of Nicodemus. So yep.
Okay. Cool.
Totally unrelated research crashing together. Tag.
Yeah, so there's a lost third work that Gnostic spoke about. I'm making stuff up, by the way, but it's Aristotle's third work on the demonic ethics, which is what he taught Alexander that he used to conquer the world. Man, I wanted to say something about the relation between the earlier work and the later work. I don't know. I haven't read the Eudemian ethics, and Peter Anderson doesn't talk too much about it. But I imagine, given the emphasis of education and sort of the cultivation of virtue, sort of the becoming virtuous over time, Aristotle may have realized that people only become virtuous if they have a social sphere to act in to practice their virtue. So you have to, you kind of need a community of people in order to practice becoming a better person, and so you can't really become a better person just all by yourself, isolated from other people. So he may have started the Eudemian ethics with a focus on an individual, and then kind of realized that that doesn't really work to think of ethics completely in isolation of other people, and then sort of redid it and integrated with his ethical view. And one of the links he makes to the political work at the end of the Nicomachean ethics is the need for sort of the political body to legislate different forms of educational practices. And so the link between both legislation and education to the cultivation of individual virtue and helping people cultivate the character they need to behave ethically. I think so that like politics is necessary for individual virtue. And also there's this link that sort of the goal of politics is at the end of the day for the good of people. And Aristotle makes the case that what is good for a person is to sort of actualize their potential for virtue. So it's a really tightly woven theoretical fabric of politics and individual ethics, where individuals need well-constituted political bodies in order to cultivate their virtue, and that is what is, according to Aristotle, best for them. And when people create political organizations, their goal should be to do what's best for the constituents, for the citizens. So he brings those two nicely together, where if you're doing politics, you need to do it with the aim to make people more ethical, and in order to make people ethical, you have to do politics right. So like those two are like.
But to do politics right, the one that is doing politics must also be an individual of excellence or a virtuous individual to have the competencies or human characteristics or attributes necessary to do politics right. And this is excluding the technical part of politics. As in all jobs, there is the technical aspect that people can learn by doing training on the theoretical and the technical skills. But then often people in jobs, they work with each other, work with others, and sometimes people even manage other people. And well, that is arguably very similar to what Aristotle described as political science. Even if it's just in the workplace and it's just managing a couple of other people. There are some considerations that we call soft skills that possibly hearken to what Aristotle was recommending.
Yeah, and so I think that's an important point. So also, in order to become like a virtuous person, there's some like required capacities on the individual that, according to Aristotle, may be missing, and sort of very problematically said women don't have those capacities, and that some people are just born natural slaves who also don't have those capacities. And if it's missing in the individual, it's kind of pointless to try to have organizations manifest that in the individual. So the human beings need the potential, according to Aristotle, and some people don't. Some human beings don't have that potential. And I don't know. It's a very like the class of people he points out is very problematic. But on the other side, it does seem that people can be born with sort of nervous system deficits. They could be born with brain damage of various kinds that just like biologically make it impossible for them to cultivate the capacities. And there's sort of varieties of things that can go wrong in biological development that may make a human being incapable of picking up the capacities necessary to do politics well. But it seems those things seem to be more or less spread across different nationalities and ethnicities and the genders and sexes and stuff. So picking out like the Greeks are almost all fit for politics except for the slaves among them and except for the woman. But barbarians and Asian people, not according to Aristotle, and that kind of racism doesn't really fly, and sexism doesn't fly.
I wonder if with Asian people they only mean Asia Minor, which is current day, where is current day Turkey right now. Probably not the entirety of Asia as we know it today. And well, as Aristotle did biological blunders like miscounting the teeth between men and women and assuming the count is different, or miscounting ribs on human beings, or assuming that sensation and lower decision making perhaps is done in the heart and the emotions and whatnot, and that the brain is just a cooling organ to cool down the heat, to compensate the heat that the heart generates. Aristotle also just looked at women and he assumed that women didn't have the potentials to develop intellectually just like men do, because at the time literally no one was there was no system that was educating women just like men were being educated. So maybe he forgot that variable. Schools, gymnasiums with philosophy schools were an exclusively male venue, as I understand. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Graham. And so since women did not frequent places where philosophy lectures were going on, and also did not typically get private philosophy tutors, well, they didn't develop intellectually, or at least overall. And so Aristotle just looks at what is empirically, and he has much stuff to do, and it just goes in the surface level at the surface presentation and makes such a conclusion. The same thing for slaves.
Yeah,
Possibly,
my take isn't so much racism for Aristotle as it is elitism. It's like the only people who are good are me and my friends that I like, and everybody else, you're just inferior because you're inferior. And when it comes to the male and women, I think that there was a female tradition back in the day that just wasn't recorded and written down that was comparable to the male tradition, but we just don't know as much about it, if we know anything about it at all. So gonna tag on those concepts.
Yeah, we don't have much, but we have kind of faint whispers or faint hints that there were female individuals like Aspasia, Sappho, or Diotima, but the evidence even for their existence is scant because of what you just said, Graham. The preservation was clearly favoring more the texts produced by men, probably.
Yeah. In terms of racism, Aristotle had a whole theory explaining why foreigners had inferior intellects or inferior characters to do with the climate. So it was very much like a regional based thing as well. Like we Greeks have a favorable climate, and therefore we have superior souls, as among the reasons why. So yeah, definitely elitism, but I'm not sure racism is entirely inappropriate to label for Aristotle. Definitely sexism isn't inappropriate. Definitely sexist.
But he also says things like this: humans have a natural tendency to gather together into groups, not only families, but also smaller communities on the order of villages and ultimately cities. And at the same time, sorry, probably the Portuguese fires or whatnot. And so he kind of says this about humans, but maybe he was meaning men that were kind of self-directed and were employing their reason, the faculties of reason. Otherwise, they just remain savages or barbarians or whatnot. And perhaps this is related to the weather. So
this is also an interesting place where he's in disagreement with Socrates and Plato, or at least Plato's version of Socrates. So in the Republic, in the early part of the Republic, Socrates says the ideal life for people would be like a small commune, so like a small village living very modest lives. And Aristotle is saying, no, not like small commune life, but city life specifically is the ideal for humans, or the natural thing for humans to do.
yeah, Glaucon couldn't keep his mouth shut and say that would be a life fit for cattle, and then Socrates reluctantly had to describe the bigger, more feverish city. We can, I think, understand that if we train ourselves to live with moderate means, we will have less impact on neighbors, on the environment, and probably we will need less slaves. And we should not kid ourselves. Even today, we might not have slaves living in our homes, but there is so much stuff that we buy that is probably made by people that receive a very small fraction of the stuff that they manufacture by hand. And so this gets into a very gray area of what constitutes a slave and what not. But exploitation of human beings continues to this day. We only abolished slavery on a surface level, like in an official sense, in the end of the 1800s, if I'm getting the dates correctly.
I'm not entirely sure, but I think that there are even some formal official remnants of slavery, at least in places like America. Like I said, I may be completely out of line here and speaking out of ignorance. I'm not an American. But I do believe some states, as part of their the laws governing imprisonment, do make compulsory labor for prisoners legal in some cases. And so I mean, there's a fairly strong case to be made that some portion of the prison population in some of those states being made to do forced labor for really petty crimes. So crimes that have very little negative impact on anyone else. So say the possession of marijuana or something like that. That could be conceived as a type of slavery. So throw someone in prison for marijuana possession, and maybe if they're a repeat offender, they can have quite long sentences and make them do work that they're only nominally paid for, but mostly it's just forced labor. Gram, am I completely wrong about that?
Nope. They hide behind that. We're paying you for it not being slavery. And no, the 1800s was a matter of they just switched the type of slavery. They went from chattel slavery to wage slavery. Yeah, and then that you now have government slavery where people get their money directly from the government. So that's who enslaves them now. I don't know if we're getting away from Aristotle or back to Aristotle there. So I'm going to tag.
Yes, so we got off that slight tangent, and I think that's more in his work on politics, where he says some people are born natural slaves, and for a lot of people that's a morally repugnant position to hold, because a lot of people take slavery to be absolutely wrong. So less in his ethics, but he does also claim that in the politics that like some people are born incapable of becoming virtuous people, and I wonder a little bit about his sort of grounds for citizenship, including wealth and nobility, because I do think that there may be some very strong genetic factors, although it's never just genetic. It's more complicated than that. It's usually genetic environment interactions, but a lot of that environment interaction can happen at such a young age that for all practical purposes may just have been, you might as well just write it down to biology, where people develop different kinds of personality disorders that are close to impossible to heal under any circumstances. Like even with modern medicine, we still don't have a evidence-based treatment that's shown to work for people with narcissistic personality disorder. And so you could be born into nobility and you can be very wealthy and just a very abusive narcissist, and I think probably incapable of being a good leader, like in the sense of a virtuous citizen that's capable of acting in the best interest of your fellow citizens.
There is very scant evidence on this, as you suggest, but I know at least of one situation in which a Nero, Caligula, or Hitler type of a ruler from the Indian subcontinent, he converted to Buddhism, and instead of being a ruthless, narcissistic type of guy who wanted just to conquer around with wars of conquest, and even had a palace a supposed palace that would attract people that would try to be thieves of it, to steal things from it, or enjoy being inside it. It was instead a torture chamber. within. He was called Ashoka. Some people call him Ashoka the Great. And when he converted to Buddhism, he dismantled that so-called palace of horrors, and he stopped conquering. And in fact, he raised a bunch of edicts set in stone from Afghanistan, Pakistan to India, which was where his empire extended. And these edicts had what is a rudimentary form of what human rights are nowadays. And so that is practically the only example that I know of. Other than this, very narcissistic leaders that became tyrants usually have are cured, so to speak, by a violent death. Like Nero suicided himself by just being crazy. Caligula was killed. Commodus was killed. Hitler was killed. Stalin, I don't remember, but probably didn't end well as well. Mussolini didn't end well. So, although we don't have scientific data, we can at least look at the historical record and see. They either kind of become really traumatized by stuff that they do, by the consequences of their actions, like Ashoka was, and they seek kind of repentance or rehabilitation, or they eventually die shortly. They don't live very long, these guys.
I'm almost certain that people who would nowadays qualify for narcissistic personality disorder, there have been historic cases of people healing from that, although not well documented at all. I'm just kind of going on a statistical intuition that even something that's very unlikely, if you have enough people, and there've been something like 100 billion people, even very unlikely things probably are examples of them happening. So just in abstract, I think that probably has happened. But so almost the fact that someone like Ashoka would go to Buddhism seeking sort of a conversion is at that point already at odds with a narcissist who would be delusional in already being superior. So sort of the recognition of the shortcoming in oneself that needs addressing by converting to, say, Buddhism is something that makes me wonder if he really was a narcissist, like someone, and like maybe makes me wonder about if he was a narcissist, how severe was the narcissism. Anyway, that's quite far off topic, but
yeah, but it seems there is a relationship with lack of self-awareness and their narcissism, and then when they are shaken by something that happens in their lives, like in the case of Ashoka, by what he realized was the bloodshed in the conquest of Kalinga, he had a moment of raised self-awareness. He realized what his life was amounting to. At least that's my interpretation. And after this realization, he sought wise people, and the wise people that were really at hand were the intellectual descendants of Siddhartha.
yeah.
I was going to say my take on that is it's not so much self-awareness that the narcissist and the Ashoka was lacking. It was other awareness, and it was breaking through that solipsistic self-awareness that they have. That is what happened with the Ashoka, where he saw the horrors of what was actually happening to other people who had real existences. And I think the biggest problem with finding treatments for her narcissist is once you get a narcissist in a therapy situation, you find out rapidly that narcissist, there's nothing that needs to be fixed in that narcissist, and they will tell you that at length. So I'll tag out that one.
Yeah, we are often seeing in history people that have very high self-esteem being atrocious to other people. So Yeah, but it's a kind of self-awareness that they have that is superficial. They are kind of enamored with a part of their personality that is very malleable. It's changeable, but it sometimes needs an intense trauma and an intense experience to reshape. While the essential attributes of human nature, these unrealized potentials that could be actualized, they, unless people are seriously physically messed up in their brains by physical lesions or whatnot, I think that this potential is there because of the neuroplasticity that the brain has. But yeah, we could go on this more, but let's talk about politics. So just to go back, of course, we talked about this natural tendency of humans. Aristotle didn't agree wholesale with Plato's Republic, and cites the Plato's Republic in his Politics several times. But he considers, like Plato, the city or city-state or polis to be the natural maximum size for a political community. Probably they considered that empires were less natural, although in Aristotle's time there was the Macedonian Empire.
Yeah, and if it's Aristotle, he's calling something unnatural, he means bad, because his idea of good is sort of whatever is the natural essence or the essential potential of something. So yeah, so if you're saying it's natural for people to conglomerate into the polis, he also has this idea that nature does nothing in vain. So if it's natural, it's good. It's like the purpose of people. Like there's something essential about people that makes the purpose of their lives to conglomerate into cities and to participate into cities. At least for some people, for citizens, people capable of citizenship. It's interesting to me. I don't know if he ever addresses this idea of, he has this notion of natural slaves, but like perhaps something like natural tyrants. I don't know. That's just something I'm curious about.
He for sure was aware of people like Callicles and Thrasymachus, even though he will not have met those in person. These types, they appear recurrently in each generation. So I'm not sure whether he would consider them natural or unnatural. But it's a good question. Any idea, Graham, if if there are natural tyrants?
Well, I was going to sit there and say, given that he's coming from Macedon and with Philip and Alexander, I would think he would sit there and say there are some natural tyrants. And it's he definitely seems to go there in some of that one where if you have such an exceptional group of people, you just need to follow them and accept that they're better than you. And again, it's that elitism that we just see constantly running through Aristotle. So yeah, that's what I'm seeing going on here. And I think his point about the concept of empire being unnatural is it's too disconnected from the needs of the general people. There's no, the city is about as large as you could get and still have some connection with the needs of the people. Once you get beyond that one, you're disconnected from the salt of the earth sort of man on the ground. And things start to break down, as I think where Aristotle's pointing to there. Going to tag at that.
It also seems that Aristotle, although he traveled in the Greek world, he doesn't seem so well traveled as people like Hecataeus or Herodotus. And so when he comments on people outside the Greek world, maybe he is just mostly citing hearsay or something like that. I'm not so sure if he was so as knowledgeable as these globetrotters. So it might have influenced his idea that all people from Asia are natural slaves.
I also think an anti-Persian bias too. Okay.
Yeah. Cities also provide perhaps an optimal environment for individuals to flourish, assuming that the city has something going for it. While the individuals that flourish have the opportunity to become individuals of excellence, and they might even participate in running the city and might even contribute further for the improvement of the city. It might become a virtuous back and forth instead of a vicious back and forth that happen maybe more frequently in history, regrettably. While Aristotle's ethics has happiness is pursued through a life of reason and virtue, Aristotle's politics show how political affairs can be arranged to facilitate such a life. So definitely there is a close relationship there. The point of political affairs is to promote the good life of all its citizens. He doesn't say an easy life. He also says in the Nicomachean Ethics that some virtues can only be achieved by engaging in some strife in moderate amounts, and also danger as well when thinking about courage, for instance. A government does not exist for the benefit of those who it governs, but for the whole community. And it's also worthy to mention his three possible types of political constitution. So there is the legitimate constitution versus its respective perversion. As the legitimate, it's focused on the good of the whole community, while the perversion is self-centered. For the kingship, we have one ruler, and its perversion is a tyranny, and the ruler becomes a de facto only citizen of the entire community, and the rest of the community is instrumentalized by the tyrant. While there is aristocracy that is constituted by a few elite rulers, that possibly Aristotle saw in many communities, perhaps even in Athens, and its perversion would be an oligarchy, in which these rulers probably many times characterized by their intemperateness and kind of hedonistic pursuit of life, they would exploit the rest of the less wealthy community to indulge their way of life. Well, there is also the constitutional government that is kind of like the good democracy in Aristotle's point of view. Citizen rule, while its perversion is what Aristotle calls the democracy, probably in the sense of rule by the less educated, the less instructed, and with an emphasis on their self-serving and perhaps at the expense of middle class and the upper class, perhaps even involving rebellions and violence, as happened during the times of the Peloponnesian War. And there's also this Greek expression hoi polloi, which means the uninstructed masses, that, well, if they take power, they might not have the interest of the whole community in mind, at least in Aristotle's point of view. And taking out.
Yeah, so maybe a link to his bases for governance. So I think the kingship would be the nobility of his grounds for citizenship. So in kingship, nobility would be very important. In an aristocracy, nobility too, but more wealth. especially in oligarchy, I think the wealth kind of takes over. And then in constitutional government and democracy is more virtue. But I think so nobility, wealth, and virtue would be more properly considered with the legitimate forms of those governments. But seeing as he thinks of virtue as the purpose of human life and the best life that is possible to live. I think I'm just kind of interpreting here, but it seems to me he would kind of favor the constitutional government if that's a government that's where people are assigned roles in the polis based on their virtue, not on their wealth or their nobility.
Well, Athenian democracy would have people from the mass of citizens, which of course was already a minority, be assigned by lot, by chance, and they would circle around to avoid embezzlements and frauds and people kind of using their position of power, even temporary, to kind of further their self-interest or give jobs to enterprises with family peoples, like nepotism that happened. So the Greeks were kind of seemingly aware of these kinds of practical pranks that people in power many times are seduced to do: nepotism, clientelism, cronyism, etc. And yeah, they employed several checks and balances, safety measures to avoid this. And then the other one is the ostracism, where people would gather around once a year during a certain period in which this practice happened, and they would pick up shards of ceramic from the pottery, inscribe each name of someone they wanted to exile from Athens, and the person that gained more votes was exiled from Athens, supposedly for 10 whole years. They had time to think and improve their character before they return.
Yeah, I was going to say that the Romans later perfected that sort of government with quid pro quo, and Aristotle. That nowadays we have it ruled by campaign contributors, rather than and it seems like the recurring theme here for Aristotle is whether the rulers are out for themselves or out for the people as a whole. And if they're out for themselves, that's where the perversion lies. And you need rulers that are out for the whole. And my guess is he sees all of them as, kingship or aristocracy or constitutional government. As long as they're out for the whole of everybody, they're going to end up with very similar outcomes. What the outcomes of the perversion of those are can take very different forms. Going to tag on that.
I think that's an interesting point to drill down on, because I think that if we come back to sort of the ethics and the more individual or the personal level, I think that kind of works in friendships and households and businesses also, where and even like in sports teams or whatever, like a good member of an organizational unit will keep in mind sort of not only the other individuals in the organizational unit, but the organizational unit as a whole. So like if like spouses will kind of consider the family as a unit and not only look out for their own best interest, and in the best case also not only look out for, say, their favorite child's best interest, but sort of consider the family unit also and try to act in best interest of the family unit. And in businesses, teams sort of trying to play or work together to the benefit of the team, not just to try to get as much as they can for themselves out of that sort of transaction. And friends sort of looking out for each other and also for the friendship itself is something.
But look at what the terms that you're employing. You're saying family, team, friendship. These are signposts. These are signifiers that point to a signifier that is arguably metaphysical in nature. So when you look at father, mother, sister, brother, You look at the individuals together and you just draw a circle around them and say family. But there is no physical manifestation per se of family. When you're talking about family, you are including all the relationships that are going on between the family members, the health of these relationships, probably alluding to how these relationships develop over time, what constitutes excellence in these relationships. So it is these words are doing a lot of heavy work because they are pointing at things that, although they are there and they can influence what happens and what does not happen, they are mostly unperceivable directly by the senses. We can only kind of immerse ourselves in a family, like people that are in an exchange student, for instance, are, and they can kind of realize if there is something wrong with the family or if the family is kind of virtuous and it's going in a good direction. And so I think this is also worthy of mentioning. We cannot talk about ethics and politics, especially involving groups of people, without having some ground to stand on metaphysically as well.
Yeah, so I could make a couple of comments on that. First, just for us, I sort of earlier today thought might be interesting to try to do like a couple of compilation clips for some of the discussions we have, because some topics come up recurrently and we say slightly different things about them in different contexts. So the question of the nature and uses of metaphysics is something that's come up a couple of times. So just that it comes up again is interesting to me and makes me think of sort of the other times we've talked about it. And I kind of wanted to say, like, yeah, there's something metaphysical about giraffes also. They aren't really just giraffes. They're just an organization of organs working together, and they aren't really organs. That's something metaphysical too. They're just organizations of cells working together, and actually there aren't cells too. That's also metaphysical. They're really just a bunch of chemicals and molecules organized together, and that's metaphysical too, because actually there aren't no chemicals and molecules. They're just atoms and subatomic particles. So you can like drill down and yeah, physics has nothing to say about giraffes, nothing interesting to say about giraffes. So talk about giraffes is in some sense metaphysical. That kind of makes metaphysics a little mundane, and at least in philosophy, metaphysics, the study of metaphysics, pertain to questions about the basic things that we assume to exist, sort of the fundamentally existing entities, unities of entities, and that's called ontology. It's a branch of metaphysics, and also questions about what can be known and how do we come to know them about such entities, and questions about the fundamental things that exist and how we can know about them or what we can know about them kind of go together. The knowledge side is more epistemology.
And also maybe the study of signs and signifiers, semiotics or semiology.
Yeah, that usually doesn't come up in sort of introductions of metaphysics, or at least philosophical metaphysics.
I would say it's important though.
Yeah, it is important. Something I wanted to say is that ontology engineering is like a branch of computer science that are quite useful in lots of different software applications to have frameworks for defining like the basic terms of an application. Like the basic object-oriented programming is a very common programming paradigm, and sort of designing the basic objects and how they relate to each other is it's just called ontology engineering. It's just basic software engineering practice, at least in some circles, and so quite mundane. And really, epistemology is something that most people who study any branch do a kind of specialization in when they look at that discipline-specific research methods. So philosophers discuss it very generally, very abstractly, in a way that's often not very useful. But in most disciplines, if you're taking university education, in that some of the courses will include research methods in that discipline, and it's basically like an application of epistemology to that specific discipline. So yeah, there are ways to make metaphysics sort of mundane and practical and like unproblematic. And I'm kind of curious. There was a movement, I think, was a Vienna Circle, logical positivists, and not only them, there were some I think Hume was quite hostile to metaphysics as well. But like, there's some philosophers who are hostile to the notion of metaphysics, and I think no metaphysics should be done. There's something bad or silly or mistaken or delusional about doing metaphysics, and it seems like you're quite motivated to correct that misperception among people. So I'm quite curious. Like,
I would ask them also to conceive of a traffic system without any traffic signs as well. It's more or less the same kind of system that they want to remove.
yeah. So, but in the case of Aristotle's ethics and politics, he has metaphysical things he can say that's relevant, and Adamson and Dominic Scott kind of bring this up. So he might have talked about his final causes or whatever that he does in his metaphysics, but he doesn't really go into detail in that. He also doesn't go into detail on his psychology or his biology, nature of souls and essences or whatever. Sometimes just alludes to them, sometimes not even very much allude to them, just treat them very quickly. And he kind of gives the excuse, like he gives an analogy between a geometer and a carpenter, who may both be interested in right angles, but the carpenter has specific work that he has to do, so some specific things he wants to build. And so for him, the study of right angles can be much more brief, and if he would get too elaborate about it and too precise about it, that would actually kind of be counterproductive, because it'll be time he could have spent building tables and chairs and beds and houses and stuff like that. Whereas the geometer wants to know about right angles for its own sake, so pursuing knowledge, so they kind of go into details about all kinds of theorems and proofs. I
got you covered in terms of the slide. Yeah, it's important to also take into consideration what level of precision is appropriate for what we want to do. Just like in the beginning of our live streams, we also realize that instead of just trying to figure out which metaphysics or which cosmology is the correct one, we kind of are maybe more drawn, or it's more appropriate to use monism in a certain circumstance, or use more like a flux theory in another circumstance. It depends on what we are trying to achieve, and I think it's much better than to be a dogmatic kind of person in terms of doctrines. It's better to look at the doctrines a bit more like tools. They really are constructs of thought patterns, of concepts, of ideas. Maybe it's more healthy to look at them like that, instead of mistaking them for something that is out there in reality.
Yeah, this is Aristotle at the most pragmatic I've ever heard them, and also this is Rogério Marques at the most pragmatic I've ever heard. What do you think, Gram?
No, I definitely agree. A lot of pragmatism going on here. It's yeah. I was going to say Aristotle tends to be more pragmatic than Plato a lot of the time, but it's a question of precision, and at what point in time is enough, and that's a regular recurring problem in certainly debating, because you can always argue that more debate is needed. Whether the governmental, let's table this and talk about it next week, and not do anything. No, that's what I'm seeing going on here. Tagging.
There's also a quote that I have here that is related, so I'll try to channel Aristotle here. And he says, "It is the mark of an educated man to look for precision in each class of things, just so far as the nature of the subject admits." So I was perusing Nicomachean Ethics while looking for the first excerpt, and I also found this one, which I found really curious, because Peter Adamson mentioned this concept. And Aristotle likes to say sentences that start with "it is the mark of an educated man," and then says something.
Yeah, strictly speaking, if he's going to say many of those kind of sentences, you should replace it is the mark with it is a mark. If there's several.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had another one. I can't remember if it was last week or the week before that we covered. I think it was last week. We talked about being able to judge the merits of
Of an
the
idea
method.
without necessarily accepting it. Is that one?
Yeah, but based on the method used to arrive at the idea in every discipline. So in all matters, being able to judge ideas based on the method that produced it. I was quite impressed by that. Like that's quite a high ideal for education that I think almost nobody lives up to these days. There are more branches of knowledge these days. Like I guess more methods. But yeah, I recall saying like I think the only people who get close to that are people who specialize in methodology. But yeah, so that sentence also started with something. It's like it's a mark of an educated man. The mark of an educated man.
Well, Aristotle could shorthand it. It's the mark of an educated man to be just like me. So, tagging.
Yeah,
It's
sometimes
pretty good mark of education.
sometimes he doesn't say that directly, but he gives so much advice, like an advice columnist, that matches stuff that went down in his life or what he did, that it almost seems like the subtext of his writing is be more like me and everything you'll just be an excellent person.
Yeah, that's kind of rough. So if it was the other way, if it was different, if he sort of gave advice that he didn't live up to, people would criticize him for being a hypocrite.
Yeah.
If he gives advice that he does live up to, people criticize him for being full of himself, for advising people to be just like him.
fair point. But he was no Socrates. He preferred to live a bit more comfortably with a bit more luxury, bling, and whatnot than Socrates. So even though he might say with some classifications that virtue is very, very important, he always says that, well, but having comforts is also important. It also comes in handy. For instance, if imagine if we had way more budget to do this that we do, we would probably achieve a wider audience in less time, etc. And if we have some merit in our ideas, we might be able to help people. Of course, this is presuming that our ideas could be of use. So he has a point in that. I think that having a nice budget, if we are well intentioned, it contributes to the exercise of our virtue. We can express virtue out into the world in a more broader way, reach more people or influence more people, etc. But it can backfire, because if people start to nurture their attachment for luxuries and comforts and whatnot, they might be a bit their focus, their attention might deviate from thinking of moral character and moral refinement to think about what is the next piece of clothing that I will buy to keep varying, mixing and matching. And maybe Aristotle was he also thought about that as well. He was seemingly he was preoccupied with how he presented himself in what he wore in a stark contrast with Socrates, who only in a very official sense with the symposium did he dress a bit more fine, but otherwise he was just wearing what he usually wears, just rags and barefoot and whatnot. So a different way of looking at how virtue plays a role and other things outside of virtue.
I was going to say, if Aristotle didn't say, virtue is best enjoyed in comfort, he really should have. Tag.
Well, he was Mr. Golden Mean guy, so comfort in just the right amount, not too much, not too little comfort. But I don't know, like virtue itself is kind of getting that balance, right? So big enough budget, not too big a budget, enough comforts, not too much comforts, enough controversy, not too much controversy.
A good mean of rhetoric and dialectic as well. Not too much of each one.
Some playfulness, not too little playfulness, not too much playfulness. Some seriousness, not too much seriousness, not too little seriousness.
Yeah.
That's like almost a cheap way to sound really profound. They just say like, all of the ways we could describe it, not too much or too little of any of those ways. Just make a long list. Like this.
And so there we have it, the Goldilocks system of ethics.
Yeah.
Not too hot, not too cold. Not too rough, not too soft. But still, we are talking again about things that are in the realm of concepts. When we talk about, is a person too talkative or is the person too quiet? How can we say for sure that the person is exactly in the golden mean between being too talkative and being too quiet? It's a very hard thing to pinpoint.
Yeah. And so, like, specifically for the theory of politics in Aristotle, some questions that maybe are left unanswered. So he says, in the legitimate rules, the rulers look out for the whole and not just for themselves. But presumably he would say, like, the rulers also need to look out for themselves. It makes no sense to sort of work themselves to death within a span of a couple of months by just completely neglecting themselves. So they have to take care of themselves somewhat, but not too much. And also sort of think of the community as a whole, but presumably also not too much. I don't know if you would consider sort of going on conquest in ways that are very profitable for the polis, but at great expense in suffering for other poli, other cities. That he may consider that or state that to be excessive, although in the time he lived, it would have been very risky to go against Alexander's kind of way I go about things. Like, yeah, it's good for the Greeks, and who cares if it's bad for everyone else?
Yeah, that ties in with the attempt at rationalizing that these other polis are not inhabited by people. It is. I think that Graham can also complement or correct me on this. There seems to be a typical pattern when conquests are involved, in which one people tries to classify the other as subhuman or not worthy of human, and as such, they go with conquering and subjugating the other peoples with less weight on their conscience, so to speak.
Oh no, exactly. That's one of the oldest human tricks in the book is just dehumanize the enemy, then you can just justify killing them and taking their stuff. And once you have their stuff, your life is better off. It's sort of hard to argue in Athens that conquest is bad for Athens. So, gonna tag on that.
Yeah, at least while it was turning out well for Athens, it was hard to argue that, I guess. It went very poorly for Athens at times. Their misguided attempts at conquest. But yeah, so I guess the thing is, so a king should look after himself and his family, but also look after his community, and not look after himself too little and not too much. And same with his community, not too little, not too much. But how to know what's too little and how to know what's too much, other than sort of be raised in a virtuous polis. There's a bit of indeterminacy there for me.
My kind of attempt at addressing that would be, since it's indeterminate, it may be an intractable problem. The only approach that comes to my mind is to use cycles of feedback and heuristics and go about doing course correction more or less on a daily basis, or at least weekly basis or whatnot, at least on a periodical basis, to reevaluate our kind of what's it called, policies, basically.
Yeah, so something that makes me think of as related to is this notion of habituation, where Adamson and Scott kind of, actually it's Dominic Scott clarifies for Adamson that it's not habituation in the way that might sound to our ears, where we think of sort of cultivating a habit, which you might sort of pick up a habit of smoking or pick up a habit of drinking coffee or whatever, and you kind of do it without thinking about it. A lot of our habits we think of them as
Or
automatic.
brushing your teeth or reading, to also give better, more virtuous examples.
Yeah. And so he says the Greek word, which I forget what the Greek word was, really just that sort of habit means
euthymia, I think. Euthymia or something like that.
Yeah, pertaining to character is almost the translation there. So if you say someone has a habit, it's almost, if someone is want to do it, but it's not necessarily automatic. And for, I think in ideal, Aristotle would consider that doing things like that with a bit of self-awareness, at least with sort of rational, with a bit of rational reflection, is superior to just purely doing it on self-habit. So that's the one thing. And then him sort of talking about how the habituation happens is sort of getting practice and doing virtuous things. He thinks over time people will develop like an intellectual appreciation for the intrinsic value, and at least that's the way Peter Adamson sort of expresses it. But one way to conceptualize what he may have had in mind is that over time people's preferences can change. People have dynamic preferences, and so the things we'd like can change. And so not necessarily a purely intellectual. So you may start off in a place where you have a purely intellectual belief that something is good, but you don't really want to do it because it's not attractive to you. And then as you gain experience doing that thing, like over time, your preferences may change so that you find pleasure in it. And I do think Aristotle talks about sort of the virtuous person finds pleasure in doing virtue, and you can sort of learn to find pleasure in virtue. Isthmos, which is what we often gets translated into habit. So I think that kind of, to me, theoretically relates to the notion of double loop learning, where there's like two kinds of learning. The one kind of learning is when you've set yourself a goal and you've made a plan and you've executed your plan to achieve that goal. You sort of use feedback on how well you've achieved your goal to evaluate how good your plan and your execution was. And you go update your plans and your execution over time to improve your goal. So this would be typically in business context where there's annual targets. You wanted to sell so many units per year, or you wanted to cut costs by this percentage, or you wanted to grow the team by some percentage, or you wanted to grow viewership by some percentage, or you wanted to read more books. So you had your target, and then you had a plan and you executed on your plan. And either you met your target or you didn't meet your target, and you kind of do that monitoring of meeting your targets to evaluate your plans and your execution of the plans. That's the first loop of learning. What you can also do is you can use the experience you've gained by doing that, by setting targets and making plans to achieve them, and then executing on your plans, and then getting feedback on whether it worked, to then reflect on your goals. And you may actually reset your goals. Now, this can all be a fairly emotionally disinterested thing, but I think the brain has mechanisms for doing something similar, where you have your desires and you make your plans and you act and you sort of towards your desires, and your desires kind of feed back information on how well your plans and your execution of your plans is working. But then over time, the brain also has this mechanism for updating the desires. And so you can grow either more wholesome desires, or you can kind of grow cynical, grow more selfish over time. So it can go either way. People can become more virtuous or less virtuous over time, depending on their experience and how they reflect on it, how they frame their experiences. And that can possibly happen at a very deep level where people sort of profoundly change their personalities. So for some personality disorders, there are documented cases and sort of more or less standard procedures for achieving change. It often does take a long time. So for severe personality disorders, on the order of around 10 years is sort of typical what a psychoanalyst might say. Like if you give me a patient once a week for 10 years, you can kind of cure them of this thing. So it may take a long time. But I mean, the difference between sort of suffering a personality disorder and then no longer qualifying as suffering a personality disorder is a fairly profound change, I'd say. That is possible on the order of a couple of years.
I'd say that it depends on the rate of change, and if someone would like to improve themselves in a certain domain, either psychiatric domain or even on a techne level, if a person manages to implement a daily habit, that even if it just involves 1 to 2 hours a day of developing some kind of activity, after a year, it will have accumulated, even with some network effect and some kind of like the interest builds on a savings account. It will be larger than the sum of its parts, of the individual days all summed up. This is one of the theses of James Clear. I also think that a word that could be used, just tell me if you think I'm wrong, conditioning, when we are kind of rewiring our the way we perceive something. So people can rewire the way they perceive a pack of smokes. That could go from a desirable and the stress release activity to something that is considered disgusting and above that person, and while they disconnect from that and they reforge a conditioning or a connection with, for instance, running or cycling or something like that, or some other habit that takes the place of the other habit. And also neurologically, probably this will change how dopamine levels peak when a person sees the cue for doing that activity. So a person that has managed to decondition themselves from smoking, when they see a pack of smokes, they no longer have such a big peak of dopamine. That is kind of like the motivation neurotransmitter. While if they see something that they have diligently worked daily to reinforce, to improve, they will probably have a peak of dopamine that will make doing that activity much more desirable and much easy to start to pick up that activity. So it could be just looking at or putting on their running shoes, and then they go for a nice healthy run. So yeah, I think this is a field of related to habits and conditioning that it's worthwhile to discuss and flesh out, because it has clearly to do with character improvement as well.
Yeah, one thing that I was observing in your analysis there is you breaking the first level loop and the second level loop. It doesn't seem like the goals are evaluated in the first level evaluation. You're just evaluating whether or not you hit them and the procedures you did. And it seems like that second level is where you're evaluating the goals. And to me, the two are going to be inherently interrelated, because if you keep missing those goals, eventually you get more cynical, if you want to say, and say, those aren't realistic goals. You know, we can't hit 100 units if we're only getting 40. The best we've ever done is 55. You know, and you sit there, and that long term is going to have that effect on you as well, with your expectations and things like that. So again, I'm not as familiar with that first loop, second loop sort of process. Is what I'm saying makes sense, where you're separating out the evaluation of goals to that higher level of loop? Tagging.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was one of the ideas I came up with is I'm trying not to go on too long a tangent because it's slightly off topic. But so in game theory, there's this notion of K-level reasoning, where it's used in behavioral versions of game theory, where the assumption is not made that there's an infinite recursion of common knowledge of the rules and of strategies and of reasoning, iterative removing of dominated alternatives. So in game theory, people often reason, well, my opponent's best move is to do A, and my best response to do A is to do B, but then my opponent knows that, so because they know that my response will be B, actually their best response is C, and because I know that my best response to C is D, and so in theory that can go on forever, but in practice people don't reason forever. They only have so much time to reason. And so K-level reasoning is basically the statistical model of how many rounds of that back and forth people do, and so different people will think. So you can also think in terms of like a chessboard. How many moves ahead do people think? Do they think one move ahead? Do they think two moves ahead? And the deeper you do that kind of nesting, the more complex it gets. But you can kind of keep going with the evaluating of goals forever as well. So again, in the first loop is like a 0-level recursion because you're not evaluating the goals at all. But in the second loop, you are also evaluating the goal, but implicitly you're evaluating the goals against some criteria, or you can even consider those goals criteria of themselves of evaluating success. So you have criteria for success that in the first level you're not evaluating, they're just your 0-level criteria. Then in the second loop learning, you're evaluating your criteria for success against criteria for evaluating criteria of success. You can keep going that. So you can have criteria for the criteria of evaluating success in like a third loop learning. You can go 4 levels or 5 levels. You just keep going. And there's a silly idea, but I wanted to coin the term K-wise agents in just analogy to the K-level reasoning in game theory, where it's kind of decision making where you with there's a recognition that some people just kind of take a rule for granted. They're not really reflective on that rule. They just have their criteria for success. And then some people sort of consider different alternatives, and they kind of wait together then to apply things like deontology or utilitarian ethics to kind of evaluate their goals. So like some framework for evaluating your life goals to evaluate your own life goals and update them. But then you can do like meta ethics frameworks for evaluating your ethics framework that you're using to evaluate your life goals. And I guess you can even go like meta ethics for evaluating your meta ethics, for evaluating your ethics, for evaluating your life goals. Can keep that going. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant, but yeah.
I have a quote here that brings your K-level reasoning and it relates to politics. It comes from the Soviet Union. Also, Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, "We know they are lying. They know they are lying. They know that we know they are lying. We know that they know that we know that they are lying. And still they continue to lie." And an historical piece of evidence of what was going down in one of the tyrannies of human history. I would also like to share with you guys a take from Dominic Scott that although it's speculation about Aristotle's politics, I thought it was interesting because Dominic Scott breaks down the eudaimonia into two kinds, according to Aristotle, or what he thinks that Aristotle thinks, in between a perfect kind, which is basically the contemplative person doing contemplative things, so being more godlike. But one cannot be godlike our entire lives. At least one needs to beg or something like that, or work or whatnot, in between the bouts of contemplation. And so between those, if a person is engaging with their fellow humans and to engage excellently, they better have an approach that has merit, that has value. And so in that approach, they are in their active life, they're being an active man. And if they are expressing virtue in their active life, they're employing practical wisdom, while in the first kind they are employing philosophical wisdom in a sense. And so yeah, I thought this really interesting.
Sorry, I muted myself for a cough earlier. I'm not entirely sure which passages of Aristotle he's basing that on. It sounded like it was just that Aristotle said perfect virtue is contemplative activity. He's sort of going from there. Like in other places, he doesn't use the qualifier perfect, so he has just like two notions of virtue: perfect virtue and just a general human virtue. And yeah, I don't know if he has like two kinds of people in mind too, possibly as well.
It says three.
Three kinds of people.
Yeah, I'll quote. I'm quoting him directly from the Nicomachean Ethics. So he says, there are, we may say, three prominent types of life: the political, and thirdly the contemplative, and the first one. Sorry, it was in the previous part. But probably it is the active life. I'm not finding the active life, but it's probably the active life, and it's much more related to sensation. It might involve a hedonistic lifestyle as well. So the more self-centered person that is going on for themselves, in a sense, in a virtuous sense, they are keeping themselves alive, basically. Then there is the political life in which the person engages with society at large, and hopefully in a good way, employing good systems of ethics and politics. And then finally the contemplative life that can be taken to the extreme of the prophet that is living in a cave in the mountain for years on end, just meditating and thinking about stuff and not engaging with society at all.
Yeah, something I'm a little curious about is it sounds like for Aristotle there would be no such thing as a virtuous slave, like a good slave. I'm not entirely sure about that, because he thinks for people born natural slaves to be the slaves of a good master, of a virtuous master, is beneficial. And presumably, like, you could have a good master or a bad master, but I would have to almost say, like, it seems very commonsensical that you could be a good slave or a bad slave. And so if you're a natural slave, like, wouldn't there be conditions for, or like virtues for natural slaves, like being an excellent natural slave or a very bad natural slave? I don't think Aristotle ever wrote anything about that. Nothing I know about Aristotle.
I don't think so.
is
He
about that.
even employs the word slave metaphorically in his Nicomachean Ethics to kind of allude to, for instance, he goes, he talks about people that are savage and brutish, and then he says, but others arise as a result of disease, or in some case of madness, as with the man who sacrificed and ate his mother, or with the slave who ate the liver of his fellow, and other morbid states. And so he almost always talks about slaves without kind of showing them in a more positive light. Or for instance, but among the Persians, the rule of the father is tyrannical. They use their sons as slaves. Tyrannical, too, is the rule of a master over slaves. For it is the advantage of the master that is brought about in it. So he mentions slaves 16 times in the word slave 16 times in the Nicomachean Ethics. He also says the slave is a living tool and the tool of a lifeless slave.
Right. So, but the passage you quoted from him, where he says the good that's brought about by is the good of the master, not of the slave, seems to be at odds with what Adamson said about him thinking that for natural slaves it would be good for the slave to serve a master.
Yeah. Well, he was kind of describing. I think, if I'm correct, the passage about the Persians being tyrannical and enslaving even their own families and whatnot. Was that one?
I don't know which passage it was. It was thinking of something Adamson said. Let's see.
So he talks about people that behave when they lack knowledge, that they would. So he says, for it would be strange, so Socrates thought, if when knowledge was in a man, something else could master it and drag it about like a slave. So he employs the concept of slave as not being virtuous, basically, or not being excellent in a sense.
Yeah. So the part in Adamson I have in mind is he says we should also recognize that Aristotle's views on women and slavery hang together with more attractive views he holds on other topics. For instance, in his Ethics, he has argued that the happy life is a life lived in accordance with reason, a conclusion many find plausible. Aristotle's ideas about women and natural slaves are simply a corollary of this. Given his empirical claim that such people are not fully endowed with reason, such people will be better off if someone who is fully rational takes charge of them. When Aristotle comes to discuss his vision of ideal political arrangement, we find the same ideas in play. He doesn't really get around to this until book 7 out of the 8 books of politics. So there's something in book 7. But yeah, so this thing that Adamson says that such people will be better off if someone who is fully rational takes charge of them. So, but presumably for such people, being obedient would be better than rebelling against their master. Now, they may not be fully enough rational to act on that, but like in their partial rationality, they may be. Mind you, the Greeks had difficulty with shades of gray and with gradients and partiality and stuff. So.
There's also further down the Nicomachean Ethics a passage that goes, and any chance person, even a slave, can enjoy the bodily pleasures no less than the best man. But no one assigns to a slave a share in happiness, unless he assigns to him also a share in human life. For happiness does not lie in such occupations, but, as we have said before, in virtuous activities. And so, unless someone can confer some humanity on the slave, and probably these essential attributes of humanity that Aristotle goes about, of having the faculty of rational mind, then the slave might start to migrate toward a life of freedom and citizenship, perhaps even. And in Aristotle's will, he even prescribes giving freedom to some of his slaves. And this is found in Diogenes Laertius' Lives of the Eminent Philosophers. That, of course, it might be or not true, but it's what we have on account of Aristotle's actually practical relationship with slaves in his life. And supposedly Aristotle even married a slave girl, or made a child with a slave girl. I think Nicomachus is from a slave girl even.
Yeah,
but
so
we've been
kind
Go
of
ahead.
sucks that he's been dead for 2,500 years. I kind of want to ask him, like,
Yeah.
sure, okay, slaves, according to Aristotle, are incapable of the virtues of a citizen with eudaimonia. So not necessarily with happiness, but just a well-spirited, like a well put together person, let's say. The natural slaves are not capable of being well put together persons. But then might we not ask, all right, we've set aside that they can't be well put together persons, but can they be well put together slaves? Like, is that something different from a well put together person? It's like a donkey can also not be a well put together person, but they can be a well put together donkey.
It doesn't seem so. It seems that people would look at slaves or people that are within the slave caste or the slave class as inferior people, not so capable of philosophy or contemplation or virtue, etc. And if a slave shows promise, like Epictetus showed a couple of centuries after Aristotle, he, even though he had a very oppressive master, he eventually was granted freedom to carry on as a teacher of philosophy. And so, and also George Clason in his Richest Man in Babylon, drawing from Babylonian culture, he describes a parable in which a guy falls into slavery, and then he starts to realize, to kind of introspect and think whether he has the soul of a slave or the soul of a free man. And after he contemplates this, he figures out that he has a soul of a free man and he has a free will, and so he does everything to escape bondage and regains his freedom, returns to his city, pays his debts, and becomes an upstanding citizen. So he both releases himself from the shackles of freedom, of slavery, of de facto slavery, and also unshackles himself from the other forms of bondage, which are the forms that people often indulge and get themselves in debt and have debts that they don't manage to pay. And so he freed himself from all these strings.
Shackles of Freedom sound like a great title for a French postmodernist book.
Yeah, from Sartre probably. I went full Sartre there. We've been going on back and forth between ethics and politics, and by now we only have mind and God to talk about. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I'm happy to move on.
Yeah, I'm good moving on.
Okay, so let's pull up some slides. So when introducing this subject, Peter Adamson introduced what contemporary philosophy of mind is concerned about, mainly nature of consciousness, relations of our minds to our bodies, philosophical relevance of cutting-edge brain science and psychology results. And then he justifiably classified how Aristotle talked about the term soul or psyche versus what actually is mind, what actually is capable of thought and contemplation. And so soul even includes all vital functions, is embedded in physical organs, and allows for sensation and movement, while mind is exclusively generates thoughts, has no bodily residence. But it's not necessarily grasping of truth. It might also indulge in fantasia or imagination. Some minds might grasp onto these fantasies and believe them, while of course people like Aristotle don't do that. Minds like Aristotle might consider certain fantasies or certain concepts that are out there, like from these crazy Ionians that he was digesting, and then he decides rationally if he wants to consider them worthy positions or not by using his organon, his instrumentation of logic. And yeah, well, this is the intro to this Aristotle on mind and God.
Yeah, so just to be clear, soul would be the Greek term suke, I think, and mind would be nous.
Yes.
So it's nice to have just that Greek reference, because Aristotle has lots of things to say about words that for a lot of English speakers they may use slightly interchangeably. So some people would use soul and mind interchangeably. For some people, not. For some people, soul has religious connotations that mind doesn't have. Whereas I think for Aristotle, mind has religious connotations that soul doesn't necessarily have. And yeah, so and there's some other things as well. So Aristotle also talks about sensation, which I'm not sure what the Greek term for is, but also knowledge, and then different kinds of knowledge. So like technical skill and scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge.
Sophrosune.
Yeah, the Sophrosune. What's Sophrosune again? I forget what Sophrosune is.
Actually, it's phronesis. It's techne, phronesis, or Sophia in the ascending degrees of wisdom, basically.
Well, Sophrosune is a thing, but I forgot what thing it is.
It's temperance. Temperance. I confused. Sophrosune is temperance. Yeah, I was confusing phronesis with Sophrosune. Sorry.
Yeah. So interesting ideas about mind. Aristotle has. So he reckoned mind was completely immaterial, so had no material counterpart, and it was purely formal. And the way thinking works was that this purely immaterial form would take the form of the objects of thought. So if you thought about a table, your immaterial mind takes the form of a table. And if you thought about a giraffe, your immaterial mind takes the form of a giraffe. And that's what it kind of means to think about them. But now your immaterial mind can also take forms that don't correspond to anything in nature, which would then be fantasies, like a centaur or some stuff like that.
This kind of makes me think about having an upside down table formed in my brain somehow because of the neural connections and because the images are inverted from the eyes to the visual cortex. And maybe in a sense there is some kind of physical neural circuitry correlates between structures that are perceived through the senses and how they are kind of reinforced by learning in neural circuits. And of course, the neurons themselves are physical entities. But then when we start to talk about circuits and patterns of behavior of neurons, we are talking less per se about physical things that actually exist and more about patterns, behaviors, summation, emergence, and it's kind of seems more or less not entirely objectionable that Aristotle maybe has a point in saying that mind per se is not directly related to a physical structure in the brain, in the body, rather.
I think his point is stronger than that. Sorry, Grant, did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to, along those lines, I find it very interesting that Aristotle tends to go more immaterial with mind than he does with soul, because it's very counter the more modern sensibility, where they would go more, soul is more immaterial than mind would be, because they tend to equate mind with brain functions like you guys are talking about here. So just going to tag on that and let you guys keep going at.
Yeah, so for Aristotle, the brain was just a radiator trying to cool off the warmth from the heart. But so I had this theory where our sensory organs work by also taking the forms of things. So for us to see red, the fluid in our eyes actually take the form of red, and yeah, I guess to hear sound and to touch. So this, like we get sensory information by the senses taking the forms of the thing they're sensing, but the senses are for him material. So we have material eyes and we have material sense organs that have the ability to take the forms of some things, but not the other things, because they're material. They have some properties and some physical limitations. There are some forms they cannot take, whereas you think the intellect has no limitations. We can, in principle, think anything. There's no thing that's outside the scope of the human mind. So human mind can potentially contemplate anything, and the only way that could be possible, if it were material, the matter itself would impart limitations on the kinds of forms the mind could take, and so it wouldn't be able to think about anything. So he takes for granted that we can think anything, and from that infers that, well, since we can think anything and there's no restrictions on the forms our mind can take, it has to be immaterial, because if it were material, it wouldn't be able to think anything. So that argument could have gone the other way. You could have said, well, since our minds are material, and material has some properties that prevent it from taking any arbitrary shape, our minds must be limited. So I guess being Aristotle and being as elitist as he was, it was much more attractive to just assume his mind is almighty and can take any kind of form and has no limitations. But yeah, so it's from there that he infers immateriality, and then he's established the immateriality of minds, and later he uses that to, like, from the establishment of our minds being immaterial. So saying, well, we have no one thing that's immaterial, and we need something immaterial to be the prime mover. So, like, moving on to God, the cause, the formal cause. Well, yeah, the formal cause of the motion of the outermost celestial sphere is also a kind of intellect, the immaterial intellect. Like, we have immaterial intellects, and they move the celestial spheres by just something like inspiring them, sort of like the intellects, by taking forms that are, I guess, beautiful and good, the spheres try to imitate those forms, and in an attempt to imitate the divine movements of these immaterial intellects, is what causes the atmosphere to move. But those divine intellects themselves don't move, so they're unmoved movers, and the prime one is just the greatest one for the outermost sphere, but there are many for the more inner spheres. So yeah, that's all. That's the kind of metaphysics that I think some people maybe rightly criticize. Don't know if you want to throw out all metaphysics, but that seems a little egregious to me.
And the Abrahamic traditions absolutely love this. as Peter Adamson even employed a pun to they are. Even yesterday, I had a conversation with a Christian that is quite a thoughtful Christian, and he says that they are so serious in thinking that since they have the right concept, the right metaphysics, everyone else is wrong. And while there are some people that are doing things wrong, they can never rest, and they will try to do something about it, either convert them or send them to hell or whatever, etc. Yeah. So and Aristotle was a huge influence to this concept, to arriving at a logically perfect in their minds description of the almighty being that's either is behind the origin of the cosmos, or it moves the cosmos, basically makes the cosmos move, and is responsible for providence and everything, and is all powerful, all omniscient, all present, etc., that the scholastics described. And I can see Aristotle being a major influence on them by describing a god as a kind of like the perfect mind, the most sublime mind that someone could conceive of, that just by virtue of existing and doing what it does, thinking of whatever it thinks, the cosmos is just inspired to move by being inspired on this mind's magnificence.
So something Aristotle does is similar to the argument for why the human intellect has to be immaterial. He argues why the mover for the celestial spheres has to be immaterials. He has an argument that goes something like, well, the movement of those celestial spheres is eternal. They've been moving forever. And no physical thing will have sort of enough impetus to drive motion forever. Because of its matter, it will have physical limitations. So you can't have a material perpetual motion machine. And so since you can't have a material perpetual motion machine, and there is perpetual motion, that the machine has to be immaterial that's driving the perpetual motion. But yeah, apparently Aristotle did not pick up from Zeno and some of the other Eleatics following on Parmenides that invoking infinity in arguments often leads to sort of outrageous conclusions if you're not very careful about how you invoke infinity and eternity and stuff in those arguments. Yeah.
It becomes intractable, and people have no way of verifying the reality of these claims. It's out of the bounds of our empirical domain even, and so either the cosmos actually had a beginning and something caused that beginning, and that something is probably above the cosmos, or superior to the cosmos, or the cosmos is infinite, which is also something completely out of our current day experience. It's something inconceivable for us. At least there were these two alternatives that Aristotle was struggling with, and he seems to have sided more, at least it seems to be, with the concept that there was a creator, and this creator put the cosmos in motion and is the prime mover.
Yeah, so just to be clear, I think Aristotle believed that the universe existed since forever. So there was never a start, but there is a first cause in the sense of there is something that nothing else causes, but it is the cause that sets in. That's so like in the causal argument. So like in an abstract space of causal arguments, there's this one thing that doesn't have any formal cause or material cause or final cause or any kind of cause, and yet it features as a cause in the cause for the motion of the celestial features. So you got like this causal argument for the causes of things that kind of terminates in a thing that doesn't itself have a cause. Though I wonder if Aristotle would agree that that God doesn't have a final cause. God, I'm not sure about that actually. Maybe wrong.
It seems that kind of a mind, as God is being portrayed here or depicted here by Aristotle, as being the most perfect, superior mind conceivable or not conceivable by humans. It would have some kind of function, some kind of utility function, some kind of purpose, some kind of goal or goals or whatnot, or at least some kind of personality or character or whatnot, because of being described as a mind. Yeah, I can see that.
Peter Anderson does talk about this divine intellect sort of thinking. So its nature is to think, and it thinks the best things. And since it is the best thing, it kind of thinks itself. And And Peterson sort of considers, I think, it looks like what Peterson is doing is responding to like questions he gets from his students sometimes, where isn't that like just terribly navel-gazing and self-obsessed and pointless for God to just be this thinking thing that always thinks about itself? And he says he thinks what Aristotle means rather than that is that like God is thinking in a self-conscious way, so it's self-reflective, or it's self-reflective of its thinking, sort of self-aware that it's thinking in the kind of sense that when philosophers think, they're kind of self-conscious about their thinking activity, but they can think about arbitrary things, not necessarily just themselves. And so whatever the divine intellect may be thinking about, it's thinking in a self-conscious way rather than the divine intellect only ever contemplates the divine intellect. Although I'm not sure if Peter Adamson is correct about that, because Aristotle did say that the best life for people is a life of contemplation, and the best things to contemplate are the first principles. So like presumably for human beings, the best thing we can do is to contemplate God, I guess, according to Aristotle. And I don't know that you would say that there is something better for God to contemplate than God. So I don't know. Adamson's reading says that's an incorrect reading of Aristotle, to think that God's thinking about himself.
It seems that a reading of the metaphysics is in order by necessity to figure this out, because I think this is all in the metaphysics, right? These are supposedly in this chapter on mind and God. Peter Adamson seems to be pulling out from the metaphysics mostly.
He does spend quite a bit of time talking about God. So yeah, I do think that's probably the metaphysics, the last couple of chapters of the metaphysics.
Yeah, no, I was going to say one thing is it seems like Aristotle is at least making nods towards Plato's absolute with, this whole concept of God here. The other one is I don't think he actually comes out and says it in so many words, but it seems like he's clearly implying that, Aristotle's intellect is that perfect intellect that everything should be patterned after. Going to tag on that.
I don't know if everything, but it's entirely possible. Well, Adamson says it this way. He says if Aristotle's philosophy leads you to conclude that Aristotle is the most godlike man that ever lived, that would probably be okay with Aristotle.
He wouldn't have a serious argument against that.
Yeah.
And since Aristotle is only one, he also said, quoting Homer, "The rule of many is not good. Let there be one ruler." And this is the meme mother of God.
One ring to rule them all.
Yeah.
So literally the atmosphere. One ring to rule them all.
Yeah. I would also like to show a kind of a joke between that references politics and history, because I think it's worthwhile. If you guys are okay with it, if you want, we can go back to any discussion here, but I think it's worthwhile to show. So let's see. Okay, so at one point in which Peter Adamson said Aristotle didn't need to read Karl Marx to develop an acute sensitivity to the possibility of class conflict, and so I imagined Aristotle reading from his scrolls while Karl Marx is reading from something, and probably these were the books that they were reading to kind of figure out that they were class conflicts. I thought it amusing that Peter Adamson said that Aristotle would consider reading or need to read something from Karl Marx when he clearly had so much historical evidence, so much historical precedents of revolts by common people against their oligarchs and instauration of implementation of democracies on the fly. That happened, I think, more than once during the turmoil of the Peloponnesian War in different polis.
Yeah, no, I think Peter Adamson's point was like Aristotle was aware of class conflict, even though he never got to read Karl Marx. So for a lot of people, they consider Karl Marx the sort of the originator of the idea of class conflict, and so I think Peter Adamson is poking fun at Karl Marx fans more than making a comment about Aristotle. He even points out that the Greeks had a word for when cities would sort of get into a debilitating kind of civil strife, stasis, which would be common enough to have a word for it.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, I always thought of stasis, perhaps from science fiction, as a thing that is alluding to something being frozen into position or stopping. And this is a struggle. This is something that is dynamic. It's different from the expectation I had of the word stasis.
Yeah, I think it's closer to our notion of the word revolution. It's a revolution or civil war.
Or civil war. Or
the concept of Cold War, I would sit there and say, where they're not necessarily fighting against each other, but they're not progressing anything forward. Just sort of grinds to a halt.
Actually, just a little bit of context, and I'll try to stay away from like actual politics. Fair enough, but I think an example of this might be so we have some municipal elections where the votes kind of split, where there's no majority party, and the parties are ideologically opposed enough that they can't even form a governing coalition that can agree to do stuff. So we have a couple of municipalities, of some of the big cities in South Africa, struggling with delivery of services because there is no functional municipality, because they're kind of stuck trying to form a municipal government with some kind of coalition, and there's just infighting. So there is no leadership. There's just this stasis, like kind of infighting, and things aren't getting done. So like waste isn't being collected properly, and all kinds of municipal services suffering because of kind of indecision, and budgets not being finished on time because people can't agree on budgets because there's no governing majority. That's the thing that could happen in democratic cities. Stasis.
It's like the stagnation is the surface manifestation. It's stagnated. The services are not working. It's all stagnates. But what is underneath and relates to the root cause is an inner conflict, is an armed wrestle between factions, and in which energy is being expended in the conflict that is not being devoted in the stuff that has ground to a halt.
Yeah, I'm cynical. That just tells me that this organized rape and pillage is more beneficial to the people than organized rape and pillage of the government. So, tag.
Yeah, that's a bit extreme.
But one question that we might pose after talking about ethics and politics, and also of human nature by talking about the mind, is we are more or less aware of some of the characteristics of our current day global society, despite its extreme intricacies and complexities. How could we go about doing something that would actually provide value and kind of nudge global society to a better direction? It's a question that I think I've had for at least a decade on my mind.
Yeah, so personally, I call myself Nerdalliun Plebz because I'm way too plebeian to be wondering what I could do for the good of global society. So I'm quite resolute to keep my ambitions much closer to home. If I can pull off like a wholesome family life, wholesome friends, maybe a wholesome small business, like I have a job with small business. And maybe if I get older and wiser, like probably stretch goal, like if I really had to stretch my ambition, sort of make some kind of small contribution to like the size of a city. But you know, I don't think I'll ever do anything that like even registers on any of the measures by which we could measure how well South Africa is doing, let alone any other country. I think it's just kind of unrealistic for me to aim to sort of do good for South Africa's happiness index or the GDP or the I don't know, World Bank well-being index for South Africa or something. Like nothing I'm going to do is going to impact those measures, and definitely not for Africa, and definitely not for the world. So,
but what's at the root? I know that you're being realistic, and you're being wisely realistic, and it's justifiable to have this outlook and position. I also have it. I also don't kind of expect me being able to do anything of note in the global scale, much less neither the national, much less the global scale. But what we can do is we can do the best in our immediate circle, as you mentioned, of course, and in that process as well, to try to better yourself, or we try to better ourselves as much as we can. So the ethics side of the this system, and I think that only if ethics achieves a monumental breakthrough for an individual to become some individual of worth, can they even start to aspire to start to engage seriously at a police level, basically, in what you mentioned as contributing something to your city.
Graham?
Yeah, no, I was going to say I'm going to go even more ridiculous. So there's a part of me that thinks again, it's the problem is that the leaderships and the parties basically put, themselves and their cronies over the benefit of society as a whole. And I think instead of at the end of, like when the president or, somebody like it, instead of at the end of the term, they're getting a nice fat retirement, we should get some sort of like, bring back ritualistic sacrifice where, yeah, they get to serve as the big high kahuna for a while, but that's the last thing they get to do. They don't get to benefit from it afterwards. And I think that would put a, kind of a cap on a lot of the corruption, sort of come back with some old school solutions that maybe we should try again. So I'm going to tag on that.
Some French style stasis. How about that?
Yeah, I heard the French are big on stasis.
Stasis is induced by literally unshackling people from their heads.
I was going to sit there and say they invented these giant cheese cutters to cut right through that stasis.
Yeah, so I'm kind of, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to stay a good student, because I do share with Aristotle and Plato and Confucius and a bunch of people that education is at the heart of this kind of project of becoming a better person. So like really thinking of myself as a student, it's what I call myself on LinkedIn. It's what I call myself on my Nerdalliun Plebz page, and studying and trying to find other people who like to study with, because for a while there I was doing it almost entirely alone. I studied through a distance university, so Didn't really have all that much contact with other students. And then after I finished at the distance university, sort of just continued on my own. I started making plans to get together study groups. So I'm really happy about this study group. It's like massive improvement in my personal studies. I have some other study groups. I have a cognitive science study group. I have a decision science study group. And like both of the purpose of those, like cognitive science is, so I'm interested in understanding minds, how they work, to hopefully make my mind work better and hopefully relate better to other people, understanding their minds better. And the decision science group is to try to learn to improve my own judgment and decision making, so that I'll hopefully make more ethical choices, better choices for me and for my family and for my friends and my colleagues, and maybe someday for my polis. But yeah, so those are like some of the things that seem doable. I'm doing them, kind of hoping they're going in a good direction. They seem to be going in a decent direction. I guess actually, I think my practice of jiu-jitsu is a very important part of all that too, because it can get a little too intellectual, I think. So something like jiu-jitsu kind of brings it into the body as well, and some of the virtues can get practiced. Like jiu-jitsu can get very frustrating very quickly, so I get a lot of repetitions, sort of practicing temperance in the face of frustration. It can also get really scary, so I get like a lot of a real physical practice being confronted with fear and panic, and sort of trying to stay cool, calm, and correct, and trying to remember what the hell my coach said. Or what do I do in this situation again? Because for every scary situation, there are things I'm supposed to be doing. It'd be really difficult to remember them if panic levels go high. But the thing is, right, I'm panicking, yes, but also all I need to do is I need to put a frame here in front of my neck so that they don't choke me, and I need to sort of scoop my hips out that side. A lot of practice doing that kind of thing. Also making friends and meeting people with very different worldviews than I do. People who work in very different kinds of lines of work, who don't think of themselves as students as all. They're just different kinds of people from me, from each other. They're also different, and so getting a bit of diversity in my life that way, and having a bit of fun. Most days we sort of begin with a bit of banter and chatter and stuff, just have a laugh before class. We have laughs after class, sort of because we see each other regularly, kind of keep track on whether people are doing well, sort of send each other messages, hoping people get better soon if they're too sick to go to class, or that kind of thing. So it's wholesome on many levels. And martial arts generally, I think some of the more enlightened practitioners of it know it's really about self-mastery more than it is about self-defense or becoming really confident at violence. Although you do learn some stuff that may come in handy someday in self-defense, but honestly, I doubt it'll come in all that handy. It's mostly a fun way to develop yourself. And I actually think music's also really important too. Of all the sort of schools of philosophy, I think Confucius stressed the importance of music the most. The power
But
of
also
music.
Plato and Pythagoras as well.
Pythagoras, yeah. So Pythagoras and Confucius. I think for a little while, music was part of sort of the standard Western curriculum. I don't know if it was in the Middle Ages or whatever, but there was a time where the mark of an educated person would be their mastery of like music theory and some kind of music instrument as well. And I think that's a way to very directly manipulate emotions in a way that sort of over time cultivates emotional self-mastery. That's different from the kind of facing fear and facing frustration in martial arts, where we sort of play with one's sadness, one's grief, and one's panic, but sort of social anxieties. Or I can play with joy and with loving care and those kinds of more positive emotions too, in ways like sort of hands-on manipulative ways, sort of experiment with those things. And one can induce quite deep trance states as well, so play with opposite states of consciousness using music. Anyway, so those are like some of the things I'm trying to do. It's mostly focused on trying to become a better person together with other people, and sort of the meaning of a better person is like also being better for other people. I do think Aristotle's view of a good person it seems a little bimodal. On the one hand, there's like this personal excellence, and then almost on an extreme, it's for the polis as a whole. He kind of skips sort of being good for one's spouse and being good for one's children, and also being good for one's friends and for one's immediate colleagues, and for one's local community, and then maybe also one's polis.
when I read the Nicomachean Ethics, I got the sense that Aristotle alluded to that if if an individual becomes better, even if it's just to manage his estate better, his family better, that's already a great sign of improvement. Let me see if I see where it is.
I don't know how much it is in any of the Greeks, but also another thing that I associate with Confucianism is this idea of sort of concentric spheres of responsibility. So you start off without being able to even take responsibility for yourself as a child. So you're in need of other people. And then as a child, hopefully at some point you pick up how to take care of yourself slightly independently of your parents. And as you grow up more independently of your parents, also learn how to contribute to the family, how to be a good child and how to be a good sibling, how to serve your parents well, how to serve your siblings well. And from there you can sort of branch out either into becoming a good worker, although I think a lot of the work in Chinese society was family-based. So sort of help feed the family, and then you may sort of start your own family, sort of become like a parent, so have a spouse and a parent, be good at that. And then at bigger levels, there'd be like business organizations or clans or stuff that you could get good at. And then there's also kind of village level organizations that you can make responsible contributions to, and more city-sized organizations, and then more province-sized, and then more I guess the provinces are somewhat like American states. And only for a very few would it ever be expected to reach the kind of level of development where you could contribute to, say, China, like the whole of China. And also the Chinese, I think, have for very long sort of used competitive exams. So with like as much corruption as you can expect from humans, but more or less fair exams to test if people have the skills and knowledge that they need to make productive contributions in positions of office. Anyway, that's a bit off topic, but I think it's just those concentric spheres of responsibility where you start closer, and then as you gain mastery and you have free time to contribute at bigger levels, then you move on to higher levels of making contributions. And then hopefully you don't make the mistake that often happens in organizations, or that used to happen more often. I think it happens less often now, where people get promoted to the level of their incompetency. So they kind of work for a level, and people show that they can handle that, and they get promoted, and they can handle that, and they get promoted, and they can handle that, until the point where they're no longer functioning. So they're like, all right, you don't get promoted.
The principle of Peter. There was this guy that jokingly described this phenomenon. His name was Peter. He called it the principle of Peter.
The principle of Peter.
Yeah, that's truly something that happens. Maybe people are a bit more self-aware and a bit more aware of when things are stupid. Maybe the Dilbert guy helped kind of disentangle some conceit that was going on in organizations. There had been a lot of ridiculous stuff going on, a lot of conceits, a lot of kind of people kind of sacramentalizing certain procedures in business, in companies, while de-emphasizing character traits. And then you have people that are kind of wielding their status within an organization, whatever it may be, and they have absolutely nothing going for them character-wise, which is a situation that merits a lot of sarcasm, caricature, satire, and it needs to be kind of exposed. It needs to be called out. If these kinds of things that are absurd and ridiculous are never called out, either directly or indirectly through things like the Dilbert comics guy did, people will just keep going on and doing ridiculous things that are worthy of contempt if we think about them seriously. And to go back to Aristotle, I found here a passage that is a bit more toned down in terms of the ambitions of where the virtuous person might start to express their virtues. And so he goes, that we should not make the same return to everyone, nor give a father the preference in everything, as one does not sacrifice everything to Zeus, is plain enough. But since we ought to render different things to parents, brothers, comrades, and benefactors, we ought to render to each class what is appropriate and becoming. And this is what people seem in fact to do. To marriages they invite their kinsfolk, for these have a part in the family, and therefore in the things that affect the family. And at funerals also they think that kinsfolk before all others should meet, for the same reason. And it should be thought that in the matter of food we should help our parents before all others, since we owe our own nourishment to them. And it is more honorable to help in this respect the authors of our being even before ourselves. So kind of similar to the filial piety that Confucius mentions. And then Aristotle goes, and honor too one should give to one's parents as one does to the gods, but not any and every honor. For that matter, one should not give the same honor to one's father and one's mother, nor again should one give them the honor due to a philosopher or to a general, but the honor due to a father or again to the mother. And then he goes on to other persons, what kind of duty we have to them. To all older persons too, one should give honor appropriate for their age by rising to receive them and finding seats for them, and so on. While to comrades and brothers, one should allow freedom and speech and common use of all things. To kinsmen too, and fellow tribesmen, and fellow citizens, and to every other class, one should always try to assign what is appropriate, and to compare the claims of each class with respect to nearness of relation, and to virtue or usefulness. The comparison is easier when the persons belong to the same class, and more laborious when they are different. Yet we must not, on that account, shrink from the task, but decide the question as best we can.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, the polis is a lot more like a humble stage to try to act on than the world stage, or even like say European Union kind of level, or like superpower level. I guess European Union is about the same size as China and America. Yeah, yet there are people who act in those things, but as far as it appears to me that they have they're kind of cogs in machines. So that like the European Union is a kind of organizational machine where the individuals taking part of it have much less power to really change course powerfully, and that's because like deliberately lots of checks and balances have been built in to stop those things being moved by one or two people, because they're just the level of problems and the scope of problems that those organizations deal with are, I think, beyond the abilities of one person to solve. And so they act slowly because what they are is they're massive teams of people taking a long time working together on taking decisions, considering very many aspects of it. Even not the European Union, we have some televised court proceedings that I sometimes watch, and there'd be some commissions of inquiry into some charges of corruption or whatever that just drag on for a year, and just the mountains of evidence that is being reviewed, and just the teams of people compiling that evidence and teams of people going through that evidence, and like their procedures for like what kind of evidence is allowed, what kind of procedures you're allowed to use to gather evidence, and this massive amount of training to sort of consider the evidence. And there's like a ceremonial judge that kind of sits there, and he's the judge that's supposed to be hearing this decision, but there's a team of people helping the judge write a final report, like a decision report. It's like not he's not sole author of what goes on there. So like I said, it's almost mostly ceremonial that he's the person making the decision. So a lot of it is almost like a theater, that it looks like something happened that's not really happening. It's like a theater performance with just this massive organizational machine in the background doing enormous amounts of work. And you could change that judge with a different judge. Yeah, you get better judges and worse judges, but like they're better or worse to the degree that they play their fairly circumscribed part in a very big machine, better or worse. And yeah, it can go quite wrong when like a significant portion of the organizations are sort of subverting the purpose of the organization, sort of breaking the rules and doing deals under the deck. And like,
it seems to go back to that concept when we talked about diotima, when people that are crewing the organization, they all just degrade into a state of uncaring. They just don't care. Then, well, it becomes unviable. It is basically like a viable system, like Stafford Beer would talk about, that is composed of non-viable components, these individuals that really don't care about the organization or its end, its goal, its purpose. And it will spell doom sooner or later for the entire system. It will just kind of be like a decaying corpse, even though it still exists and still seems to be there historically. I wonder often if some systems nowadays that we see that they are there, if they are really truly alive and can withstand millennia, or are just corpses on decomposition. But to bring the conversation back to kind of like our potentials for engagement in the polis or engagement in political life and etc. Of course, the three of us, we are part of nations where elections take hold. That is the most obvious way to participate, even though many people argue that it doesn't make any difference. It's fair point. There's a huge amount of inflation due to the amount of people actually voting. But I would argue that this is just one of the one of the many ways that an individual person that has the citizenship rights in a nation can participate. I, for one, have exchanged emails with people in the Portuguese government, in the assembly, to get information from them about laws, to ask them to think more highly of, for instance, the situation of houses in decomposition spread around the country, and for which there is no legal framework to kind of avoid happening and take houses out of that situation. And I also exchanged emails sporadically with a person in the European Commission of the EU. But these both instances were very sporadic. I didn't kind of put my mind to it to kind of engage with them, with people in such positions on a long term, and to kind of write very thoughtful emails to them to kind of get them get their attention, get them thinking about things, ask hard questions, and etc. And this is the second possibility to engage with political life. It's contacting people thoughtfully. It might not be always possible because sometimes governments they don't offer these channels of communication. And the third one that almost no one thinks about is to actually found a political party, or even enter a political party that already exists. But probably if we think about entering a political party that already exists, people will justifiably say that, well, the exception, the fraud is not the exception of these systems. Fraud is the norm. And so people that enter in well-established political parties probably will have many strings attached. to be able to express any virtue. What do you guys think about this?
I just thought it quite funny. Like, countries can be quite different. So you're saying almost nobody thinks of the possibility to start a political party in South Africa. Like, it's very common for people to start political parties, and I was curious. And I'm not going to do a massive amount of like searching around. I just did a quick Google search for number of political parties, and I found a website, the Electoral Commission of South Africa. I don't know if I'm on the right page, but there's a number here. Total parties 2,335. It occurs to a lot of people to start political parties in this country.
Okay. Maybe there's a future for education in political science in South Africa, since there seems to be an audience.
The numbers that get their membership above 1,000, on the other hand, aren't as many.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Maybe
No, I was
just
gonna
start it randomly about one subject. Go ahead, Gram.
No, I was going to sit there and say, you watching those trials of political corruption. It's one of the things I learned how to enjoy them over in America is they're not having them whether to show that person is corrupt or not. It's whether we can prove they're corrupt or not. It's almost assumed that they're inherently corrupt, and it's just they're exposing just how poor they were at hiding their corruption. And that's my way of looking at it. Just seeing watching them exposed to just how bad of a corrupt politician they are. Tag.
Yeah, something I couldn't get behind. So I've been trying to sort of meet people to study and grow together for a while. Some people have kind of have this strategy that their contribution to making the world a better place is sort of finding a guru that they can get behind and kind of becoming fanatical devotees and proselytizing the word of this guru. And if only everybody knew this guru's teachings, then the world would be a better place.
But that guru is not a guru; he's a sophist, probably. By what I'm realizing.
Yeah. So I mean, even if he wasn't, I take Peter Adamson to be an honest scholar. He's not a perfect scholar. He has these flaws and he has these critics. Gram, I don't know if you were around when I told Rogério, like one of his critics says many of these episodes are a lot less interesting than the corresponding Wikipedia page. It's quite a brutal critique of it. But I wouldn't dream of putting him on a pedestal and sort of trying to convince the world, you know who you need to pay more attention to? You need to pay more attention to Peter Adamson. I think like he's someone I want to pay attention to because I think like where I'm at in my sort of studies, it's a worthwhile exercise going through the history of philosophy again, like from a different perspective. It's not the first time I've gone through the history of philosophy. But I recognize for some people that's a waste of time. Like, just generally have a lot better things to spend their time on than to listen to this guy. And I wouldn't dream of trying to sort of proselytize for Peter Adamson.
Since pleasure is a thing, and for some people it's the only thing, it's the only kind of thing that prevents them from falling even deeper into nihilism. It's already there, the nihilism, and the sense pleasure is masking it, like Nietzsche would allude to. And they don't have anything more wholesome to fill it in. And of course, as Aristotle would say, the roots of education are bitter, for sure. Yeah, when people start to dip their toes into a new field, it will be perplexing, confusing. People will be frustrated. Probably their patience will be tested. Mine certainly was when I started to listen to the philosophers, because they started to sound at first quite foreign to me. And they made so many references to Homer, especially the Marcus Aurelius, that they went all over my head. And then I read Homer and I slogged through it. There are some philosophers in the history of philosophy that did not read Homer. even Frederick Douglass took a stab at people that claim being intellectuals that start reading something and never finish. They just jump from one thing to the other. And if we really engage with a field of study, like we are attempting to do in the case of history of philosophy, sometimes some quite original ideas might come about, like when we mentioned looking at doctrines like tools to think, instead of just attaching ourselves and being kind of like the doctrine is like a one-itis. We are all suddenly monists, and we put Parmenides on a pedestal, and we just think about monism entirely and dismiss ab initio everything else. But no, we instead figured out and thought about how would things be if we look at different doctrines as potential tools, and we try to look at the occasions, and if we have a big tool set in mind, we might find a nice tool that is appropriate to the problem or to the occasion and employ it, but we don't kind of put the tool or the doctrine on a pedestal or kind of assume it's the end of all the questions, and rather we are becoming much more acquainted with having hard questions for which probably there will never be any answer, not in a million years, because some of these questions maybe transcend the regime in which human minds can operate. And one of the things that is good to cultivate is to become okay with having questions that have no answer and keep musing about them. Who knows what will happen? Because many people just want a fast and straight to the point answer. Is there God or is there no God? And people say there is a God. He was derived from Yahweh or whatnot, and this is the correct God. End of discussion. And then people just go around assuming that they have the ultimate truth, and who does not have this supposed truth that they have is wrong, and will pay the price, and should pay the price, and should be judged even by these people because of not adhering to their axioms. And so embarking on a travel, on a journey, either physically like the Ionians did and encountered so many different traditions, religions, philosophies, different arches, different first principles of the world, and starting to realize that maybe we will never have the definite arche. We will probably never have the definite religion. We will probably never have the definite doctrine, one size fits all, one doctrine to rule them all. Probably at best, we will have bits and pieces of doctrines and individuals of merit that we can attempt to integrate into our own frame of mind, our own toolkit, our own bits and pieces of philosophy, our own system of meaning. And if I gained anything so far from this, was at least that instead of putting one person, one individual in the pedestal, we should kind of try to broaden things. And online in Twitter, when I see someone that might be somewhat receptive, I kind of show them a thread that I built with like 41 different thinkers from different geographies, different eras, since antiquity to almost contemporary times. And I share them. Well, pay attention to guys like these, not necessarily these ones. Don't put any one of these as your guru necessarily, and listen to what they have to say. Dismiss what your reasoning tells you to dismiss. Test these things out in your own life instead of just making a judgment at face value. So taking out.
Yeah, that was cool. Graham?
Yeah, no, I was going to say a lot of that whole wanting the guru aspect ties into that hive mind that we've been talking about, where it's so much simpler and easier from a cognitive energy standpoint just to adopt that single set of rules. You know, like with Aristotle here, it's so much easier for somebody just to say, okay, I just am going to agree with everything Aristotle said, even though, he got the number of teeth wrong, he got some details wrong, but you know, the rest of it's close enough for Greek work. So, you know, why do I need to expend the extra effort to try to correct where Aristotle might be wrong? And I think that's where some of that drive for wanting to find that correct guru comes from, is once you find that correct guru, that's the last decision you actually have to make. You're done. All you have to do is just fall in line. And that doesn't work for everybody. It's like that's not my recipe. So I'm going to tag on that.
It's something I wondered a little earlier. I had a similar thought. Like, there do seem to be people who really dislike deliberating over decisions, and they prefer authority figures to tell them what to do. So their decision comes down to obey or disobey, and as long as they're obeying, they're good people. So a good person obeys the relevant authority. So they have their authority and they obey that authority, and that makes them happy and it feels meaningful to them. And I wonder if there are people who are kind of stuck in that condition where they're not going to change, they're going to prefer to live their lives away. And I wonder if that's like maybe one of the kinds of people that Aristotle had in mind as a natural slave. Like, they want an authority figure to submit to. Like, they don't want to think for themselves. They don't want to deliberate. They don't want to reason. It feels like it hurts them to reason. Like, it's effortful and painful, and they prefer to avoid reasoning through things and deliberating through things and contemplating things and learning. They prefer following orders. It's what they want to do. And yeah,
I probably wouldn't use the term slave, which has a lot of very harsh connotations, especially because of what happened in the 1800s when slavery was abolished, and we have so much accounts and biographies of the horrors of that kind of slavery. I would say maybe more people having a more servile outlook, or a more less sovereignty, less self-sovereignty. So they are still not have not attained that stage in which a person picks up the reins of their lives and becomes a sovereign individual. Maybe it's a bit better to flesh it out instead of just using a term that is doing so much heavy lifting. We should not overburden words beyond necessity.
Yeah, so I don't mean to call them slaves. I was just genuinely curious. So Aristotle had this notion that some people are natural slaves, and like I said, slavery is a very loaded term, and it's easy to jump to conclusion. Oh, that's a morally repugnant thing that Aristotle said. Like, there could be nothing insightful or right about that at all because of how morally repugnant it is. But if you sort of change the word that he used, maybe so, like, there are some people who are better off being obedient to authorities, like, than trying to. Some people are natural followers, like, something like that, rather than natural leaders.
Yeah,
We still may oppose the word natural. So like natural in our context it'll also be a bit problematic because there's sort of the connotation with racism and sexism and all that kind of thing. But for Aristotle, that natural sort of relates to the telos, and so instead of natural, we say there maybe for some people the purpose of their lives is to do a good job at following authority. For maybe, so I think much less problematic in our cultures, or in all cultures, much problematic these days is to say something that people's lives don't necessarily all have to have the same meaning, the same purpose, and so we kind of find our purpose in life, and maybe for some people it's okay that their purpose in life is to be obedient to some kind of authority figure, be it like a religious authority figure or a political authority figure, or like a family member, so a patriarch or a matriarch, or a husband or a wife. They just kind of kind of get in line with, and they try to do a good job of serving that authority figure, and that's where they find purpose and meaning. And I don't know that we have necessarily good ground to bully them into being more independent and being more sovereign. In fact, they may find the sort of the philosophical indeterminacies, the uncertainties, and the ambivalence, and the conflicts of different values and the moral dilemmas so psychologically distressing that if you try to bully someone like that into being more sovereign and really thinking through the moral dilemmas for themselves, is it possible that we could like do them harm, like sort of drive them into a nihilistic despair, or like a feeling of meaninglessness, when we say like, no, you should think for yourself, and then when they think for themselves, they get confronted with these uncertainties and ambivalences that they're not emotionally strong enough to handle, and sort of descend into despair because of those things. Whereas if they just followed the authority is thinking through those kinds of things and coming to a conclusion, and that sort of puts them at one remove from the uncertainties and the ambivalences and the conflicts, and easier for them to process emotionally.
Some people, and as usual, human beings are typically described as having the attribute of realizing their own mortality, unlike people used to say other animals. So some people claim this is a defining characteristic of human beings, being aware of our mortality. And some people go to a guru or a leader, and they want this leader to dazzle them with their rhetoric and poetics and speeches and content that they produce and stories that they tell, etc. These stories might be these true world theories, like Nietzsche would criticize, that kind of sweep under the rug things that people that are arguably real, like individual human mortality, and give people a sense that this reality is just a prelude to something much more desirable, amazing, heaven, and that you need to do what this leader of this group tells you to do to have admission. And many people, instead of being determined to face their fears on themselves from scratch without using any acquired wisdom from wise persons that they might have studied, but they did not study any of these wise people before. So they are kind of vulnerable in the how they are fearful of their mortality. And so I can see how the Abrahamic traditions became very popular over the last couple of millennia, not just because of this, not just due to the people's fear of their own mortality and ephemerality, but joining this also people's social needs. Basically, people want to feel a part of a cohesive group where there is good faith and there is a good relationship between peoples, and so if human nature of each individual person has all these vulnerabilities exposed because they have not been filled with something more wholesome, something more conducive to self-mastery, to sovereignty, self-sovereignty, they are almost the ideal prey for these kinds of groups that are headed or crewed by teams of sophists that employ not logical and thoughtful means to arrive at some position, but they clearly use sophistry, these how should you say it, fictional accounts that are inscribed somewhere. They use these, and people prefer, instead of having to confront their doubts, the void of meaninglessness and their mortality and even their solitude, they prefer to be part of such a group and find comfort and companionship and a prepackaged meaning in these groups than having to do all this heavy lifting for themselves from scratch. In my personal journey in my life, I started in Roman Catholicism and then just bailed because I asked them questions and I wasn't satisfied with the answers, and they seemed to be exhibiting inconsistencies that even my teenage minds picked up on. And so I devoted instead myself to the pursuit of figuring out scientific knowledge, to acquiring scientific knowledge. Clearly, I had a huge blind spot of not paying any attention to more poetic literature, mythopoetic philosophy, and this only came afterwards. And so now, having the combination of looking at different religions, what they are worth for, the different philosophical traditions that so far I've acquainted myself with, and also combining this with the tools of science. This kind of work that I've been doing, at least for myself, has been paying dividends. By, for instance, studying Buddhism and Stoicism, I can look at truths that are a bit unsettling and disturbing, and not being so disturbed, even though we emotionally have emotions naturally, and it's unavoidable. At least it seems that I have a bit more tools to process them in a healthy manner, instead of that caricature of the Stoic that is unfeeling. No, we all have feelings, but if we at least have something to deal with suffering, instead of just dealing with suffering from scratch, and we didn't sell our soul to the devil by joining a sophist kind of cultish group, and keep our individual sovereignty, maybe we are in a better position to have the reins of our lives and inspire others to kind of also embark on an individual path of self-mastery. So yeah, this is more or less me grabbing the obvious examples of my own life to show a different path, instead of just the collectivist, sectarian, doctrinal, sophist kind of thing. Of course, showing respect to religions and how people find comfort in them. There is, of course, merit in them. So yeah, I think that it is worthwhile to look at different traditions and compare them, just like Aristotle did with different indoxa.
Why do I feel the need to stand up for the sophists at this point?
Please do play devil's advocate.
Well, the aspect of the whole sophistry that you seem to be downplaying is that it's easier and it pays better. I mean, that's part of the point of the whole sophistry. Again, part of the point of academia is you always have somebody who's getting paid to argue against your point. That's why both of you have salaries. It's just to argue against each other. And you pick one of the off-the-shelf belief systems, argue for it. Again, not much thinking in life, decent paycheck. It's not a hard life. There's something to be said for it, at least. It's, again, Socrates would kind of look askew at it, sort of that unexamined life, but, sometimes it's more comfortable.
Yeah, there's something to be said for it, and maybe the easiest things to be said for it is like that kind where people sort of just sophistically waste time with pointless arguments and drawing salaries for that is not as bad as the worst tyrannical rulers, and so they're making a living, and yeah, maybe they're wasting a bit of money, but that's not the worst thing that they could be doing. So yeah, there are actually many people in many occupations that are maybe taking more money than they're really deserving in terms of their contributions to the organizations. Actually, something that's quite interesting. I've been reading a book on negotiation analysis written by Howard Haifa, with a R, but I think it's pronounced Haifa. Not sure about that though. And he's sort of talking about the different ways to go about negotiation, and you sort of, if as an analyst, you have to kind of figure out in a specific case of negotiation what the communication pattern is. And there's like situations where negotiations break down entirely and people become entirely untrustworthy and stuff. There's not too much interesting to say from an analytical point of view about those things. And you kind of, there's like intermediate stage where people don't really trust each other and they will overstate their positions and they will sort of be biased and everything, but more or less they'll stick to reasonable interpretations of the laws for the most part. And so they're like really biased and only partially truthful with each other. But still mostly law-abiding. You can say quite a lot about that. And then there's this one thing where he sort of holds up as the ideal. Like if you're going to be negotiating with someone, you want to have a chance to create joint value. You want full, open, truthful communication exchange. I think it's FOTE, something like that. And he just makes, like in passing, this offhand remark. He says, only very occasionally does this kind of communication happen in academia. I thought, yeah, I've noticed, but it's nice to be validated by like a really senior researcher.
Yeah, it's good to have someone shed some light on what apparently looks like something normal, part of the landscape, but they shed light on it, exposing its absurdity. The king has no clothes.
Yeah. I also like that it was just a passing remark. Which is like, also, by the way, only very occasionally are academics any kind of honest. And then moving on, and like, this is not a book about the dishonesty in academia. This is a book about negotiation. It's just like that one sentence.
Yeah, it's just like a drive-by with Uzis.
Just like quick and surgical execution. It's a little less tasteful for me with people who like just go on at length about it, like maybe we risk doing now, about just how unfair it is and like endlessly toiling about their experiences with the corruption in academia and how everything's lost and this should be this aspect should change and that aspect should change and that aspect should change. Like, I think I've seen some people kind of do like an outrage milking of, did you know there's corruption in academia, and then just try to get an audience based on how outrageous it is.
Yeah,
that's a little.
People do that with so many things in so many arenas.
Now, I use the model of sort of like professional wrestling for like a lot of the academia. Can you really say it's corruption in like professional wrestling when it's staged events? Is that corrupt or?
I mean, so on the extreme end, if you go to a film and you're going to John Wick, it's not corruption that he's not really killing people in very impressive ways. So it's only fake killing. Professional wrestling is slightly on the border where they're kind of pretending that it's real, but in a very obvious way, and most fans kind of know. And like a lot of the fans are kind of participating in pretending it's real, like willingly. I'm not so sure that counts as corruption.
But it does seem to have changed through time. During the Hulk Hogan times, things seemed a bit less soap opera-y, and then they completely went overboard with fantasy and fiction on top of the supposed wrestling. I think there was this degradation.
But it's so like on the part where it is corruption is if at the Olympic Games there are under table deals so that preferred candidates from preferred countries win regardless of their talent or their merit on the mat, and meanwhile to the audience the pretense is that it's real. That seems a lot more corrupt, although for most of the audience they're not really losing a bunch by doing that. If you're beginning to selling courses to students labeled science and it's a bunch of sophistry to try to convert them to your religion, now you're taking money for a product that you're not offering, and so that becomes much closer to, I think, just fraud. Although the specific case I have in mind would be very difficult in court to prove they're fraud. So it's almost like the politics thing, like it's corrupt, but can you prove it's corrupt? And yeah, like on an even more scale is when you're selling like fraudulent medicines to people with terminal illnesses for which there are proper medicines, so that people die because they wasted money on your snake oil and they could have gotten real medicine. So looking at like a couple of homeopaths or something, that's so if I had to put like things on scale, this theater that's pretend, and everybody knows it's pretend, and they pay because it's pleasant pretense. Then there's something that's kind of like it's pretending, like reality TV, like it's pretend reality. It's still pretend, but it's kind of pretending to be reality, and people are kind of in the know that it's not 100%. It's mostly pretend. And then there's stuff that's presented as if it's reality, just straight up, like nobody's, like it's like the Olympics, but it's not. It's fake. But nobody really loses it. And then there's like these small transactions where you're kind of like buying something and getting something else in a way that costs you money, and it's like wrong, but I mean, you're not going to die from it. And then there's sort of fraudulent transactions that people fucking die from. So I think there's like a spectrum of like how bad things get.
Yeah, I think you nailed the painting the gray area of morality with concrete examples that pretty much everyone can understand. And this also, of course, when people are engaged in certain types of activity and they do it repeatedly, pretty much in every circumstance that you described, there's this repetition also. People are either being morally uplifted by what they do, in their character is improving little by little, or they are literally degrading their character. And people that kind of just find it useful and maybe even practical to steal towels in a hotel because they are just there, and no one is supposedly watching while they're inside their room. Then they might kind of little by little graduate from these extremely small and petty crimes to little by little do other things, because sometimes when people don't have ethical checks and balances that they did not pick up in their education, then they kind of go into the slippery slope kind of progression. And people that were not criminals at all, they just commit the first crime by occasion and opportunity. They were opportunists, and then they start to do things with more premeditation and more and more social impact. And they are building the consequences of their actions. And if this goes on, it's unsustainable. They will eventually face the consequences of their actions if this slippery slope keeps going on. The Eastern traditions talk about karma as being merely not something supernatural, but being the consequences of your actions. And when someone is doing something that is supposedly morally degrading, like for instance people that work in slaughterhouses, and they might have started with being someone that never slaughtered any animal, they have two choices to continue on this job. They either go crazy, or they kind of go desensitized. They desensitize themselves to be able to keep doing that. And maybe this desensitization might have social repercussions that might not be good, because they might find themselves in a situation in which they might want to vindicate a lost one or something like that. And since they are already desensitized to killing, there's always this possibility of going through this slippery slope, this downward slope of moral degradation. And so I think this is also worthy of mention, because it has social repercussions. And it can also be flipped. People can be gradually morally uplifted as well.
Yeah, my takeaway, Nerdalliun, is you're not a fan of homeopathic therapy for terminal diseases, and you just don't recognize the profitability in the saying "dead men can't file lawsuits." That's that's how it's shorthand what you had to say there. Gonna tag on that.
Yeah, it's just an underdeveloped business sense. That's what's going on.
Well, what you were talking about is, business values, and it's like, what are you talking about? There's only one value for a business: it's profit. What's this other stuff? Tag.
Now you're embodying the American stereotype that many people here in Europe talk about.
Oh, that's more my economic training than my American stereotype.
Yeah, I think I should go and practice the ritual of having something to eat, having a bite. It was, as always, immensely rewarding and enriching to participate in this with you two guys. And next time I think we will wrap up Aristotle and move on to other continents.
Yeah, looking forward to that. Thank you both.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it. Great time as always. Tag.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.